Welcome to the Dark Zone Adventure Racing Podcast. This is your host, Brian Gatens. We love course reveal podcasts. This is for the racers, fans, friends, whoever it may be. And we always drop this the morning of the race. So if you're listening to this, this is coming out the morning of Rootstock Racing's Two Rivers Adventure Race, which is serving as the North American Adventure Racing Championship. We are joined by Abby Perkiss and Brent Freedland of Rootstock Racing, and we will break down the course. This is a course reveal podcast. All you're going to hear about is Two Rivers. They'll talk about the course design, the logistics, the different things to consider, but we're going to dive into it. We're going to go. So Brent, I'll just kick it to you first for the first question. Could you walk our listeners through the logistics of the race, the stages, the distance, things like that? Big picture.
Yeah, thanks, Brian, for talking to us about the course. We're really excited about this one and excited about all the teams that are coming. It's a really great field of teams. It'll be a fun, really fun weekend, I think, for everybody to dot watch. The course is a bit of a, more expedition than it is kind of a standard short 24 to 30-hour race. We have basically, I think we technically have 6 sections. So we're opening with a pretty sizable trek. We theoretically roll into a substantial paddle. And then there's a little micro section. It's a little trek to get off the water over to their bikes. And then it's basically a big bike stage. It's technically actually broken into 2 stages. But, they're both biking. So the first bit of the bike is a mountain bike orienteering loop. And then it's a pretty long linear ride with one small detour to a small embedded foot section. And then they wrap up with a big, significant kind of classic Pennsylvania wilderness trek. So, you break all that down and, it's kind of like, I think, 4 big stages with a couple little things along the way. That said, our full expectation, we're recording this ahead of time and we're still kind of waiting for another day or two before making a final call as of this recording. We think that the paddling is going to have to go. Water levels are historically low. I was out last weekend setting parts of the course and scoping out the river. And I just think it would not be an enjoyable section for most teams. And so what that means, unfortunately, is we will lose the little trek kind of in the middle of the race, and the bike stage gets bigger. So now we're effectively talking about a trek, a very big bike by one-day standards, and then a big trek at the other end with a small trekking loop still embedded toward the end of the bike loop.
Abby, kicking it down to you. You've had the chance to work on a wide variety of rootstock races. For the people sitting at home who know rootstock and are curious about the course itself, how does this measure up, in your opinion, to other rootstock events?
Yeah, so this is actually an interesting course. When we were invited to design and direct the inaugural North American Championship, we had 2 other courses in mind that, for various logistical reasons, we were not able to effectuate. So this, on some level, is a course where there will be bits of it that are familiar to racers in terms of the land, in terms of some of the TAs. But we have worked really hard to create a course that will feel quite different section by section. So, we're starting at World's End State Park, which is land that we've used before, but we've used it in a totally different way. The first TA will be at the Forksville Fairgrounds, which we used as the finish line for a race a number of years ago. And then, as Brent said, they probably, unfortunately, won't embark on a paddle on the Loyalsock Creek. But it is a paddle that our racers did in, I believe, 2019. And they did it in metal canoes. So not ideal boats for the conditions. We actually intentionally put this back in as a pack rafting leg, thinking it would be so much fun. Racers could really get to use their pack rafts in the way they are intended, in really splashy, kind of pushy water. This is a stage that's being sponsored by MRS Pack Rafting. We've been super excited about it. They move to from there. They were to get on foot and at Crystal Lake Camp, which is a big kind of ski area and camp, which we used in a Stockville, which is another 2-day foot event that we've put on. And they're doing a mountain bike loop there, right? They had been on foot there before, and it had been our mid camp. So a number of these stages, and this goes all the way through to the finish, a number of these stages are on land that we have used in different capacities, but racers will experience them in totally new ways.
Yeah, I was there for
the highlights reel of the PA Wilds north of Williamsport.
Yeah. It's a gorgeous area. And for those, and first off, folks at home, very robust media presence. Be sure to follow on Facebook. Be sure to follow the different media channels. They have a great media team. And I want to get to the media team at the end of our recording today to give everyone there a shout out. But I've raced in this area, and I was there in 2019, and water is water, but I hear what you're saying about the loyal sock. Brent, I know you might want to add something to that, and then I want to talk a bit about that first stage. So Brent, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to stress something. We were actually apprehensive to go back to loyal sock again. We had decided we were going to let it breathe for a while longer. And when unfortunately these other two courses, which we had put months into trying to permit and work with, kind of fell through, it felt like loyal sock was our best bet just because we have such a great relationship with them. I just want to stress a couple things. So like in World's End, we're actually not using land we've ever used before. So we're in the park, we've used the park, but the first trek will be completely new. And then what we did before determining whether we wanted to move forward with this course, especially because of the nature of the race, right? We really take the responsibility of directing a regional championship for ARWS seriously, and we wouldn't have done it if we felt like we were going to be recycling something that would give a lot of teams either an advantage or frankly just be kind of a boring, let's do the same thing over again. So we actually did a pretty deep dive analysis of the year we did Stockville, where we came in and out of Crystal Lake for mid camp. And then also the Stage F trek, has some familiar terrain. And we really went back to our results and looked very closely at how many teams actually went out on those sections and did anything of any substance. And we found that, thankfully, there are very few racers that are going to be present this weekend that really did anything in those two sections at all. And then the nature of the Crystal Lake one, as Abby said, is completely different than the way we used it the first time. But we felt really good about that. And I just want to add that and stress that we did a really close analysis of our past records to make sure that we didn't have, 50, 60, 70 people coming that all would have this knowledge that they don't.
Especially because it's a championship, right? So you want to make certain you're taking that away. So let's dive into the first stage. I'm looking at a map. I see stage A in front of me. I see a variety of checkpoints. On the maps themselves, we have numbered checkpoints. We have lettered checkpoints. What's the distinction?
The way we design our courses is a modified Rogaine format. So we lay out kind of at base a mandatory route that is not linear in nature. Like there's still plenty of route choice within these sections, but that is kind of the core course. And then from there are optional points that teams who maybe have a little bit more fitness or a little bit more experience or a little bit more navigational prowess can add on. So racers are official finishers if they get through the mandatory course, get through each of the TAs and make it to the finish line. So all of the numbered checkpoints on each stage are the mandatory points, and then the lettered checkpoints are the optional points. And right now we have a mandatory course that we've laid out for stage A. We actually may expand that some in canceling the paddle to kind of augment that stage just a little bit for folks on the ground.
So the question I have for you, Brent, I'm going to kick it over to you. I'm looking at the map now. People will be listening to this podcast who don't know the Pennsylvania Wilds. They don't know World's End. Terrain-wise, challenge-wise, what are the racers in that first stage going to come across?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, Pennsylvania has the loving nickname of Rocksylvania for the folks that like to hike the Appalachian Trail or at least do the Pennsylvania section. It's actually not as rocky in this section as some are, but there will be some stretches where things will get pretty technical for folks. This is actually especially true at the end of the stage when they come down through checkpoint. I believe it's number 5. the final descent through to TA1, that descent is the real deal. And you get a lot of that. You get these very steep ascents and descents up the mountainsides, and then you get kind of plateaus on top. At least in this part of the course, that's what they'll see. So the beginning of the stage will be relatively straightforward. It's basically a trail to get them up and out of the World's End State Park. There's a beautiful vista, normally a beautiful waterfall. It's really, I'm so disappointed about the drought right now, because I went out and scouted this course in the summertime when theoretically usually the water is at its lowest around here, and even then it was spectacularally beautiful. Loyalsock State Forest, I think, is my single favorite piece of land that we've worked in the state. There are things about some other spots that I absolutely love, but it's waterfall after waterfall and vista after vista. It's a really special place when you think about it from a water perspective. So the waterfalls are like a trickle right now, and usually these are waterfalls that even in dry times are running and scenic. So there's still like a rugged beauty to it, but I think it's something I'm pretty disappointed by, that they won't get that full Pennsylvania effect. That said, there's a couple other waterfalls on the course, on that stage. And there are some spots where there's some, good off-trail navigation that will, I think, test some of the more experienced teams, especially on the kind of the north edge of the map, where there's a number of optional A points. As Abby said, I think that there's a good chance we will turn a couple more of the A points into mandatory points. She alluded to this, but we are effectively cutting out a minimum of probably 6 to 7 hours of race because of the fact that we're cutting the paddle, but then also cutting the trek that comes out of the paddle. So I think, for the very fastest teams, we're probably cutting 6 to 7 hours. And for everyone else, it might be as much as 10 hours. So, I think we're going to ultimately, I know this isn't what you asked, but I think we're going to see more and we're definitely going to see more teams clearing the course. But I think we're going to see quite a number of teams maybe have a shot to get close to clearing, if not clearing, that normally are not entertaining the thought of that.
You touched on this next question a little bit here, but I want to come back to it, recognizing it's a relative question. In adventure racing experience, when I'm looking at the map here and I'm seeing trails, I'm seeing roads, I'm seeing big features, how complex will they find the navigation, and how hard will they have to work to stay out of those out of bounds areas?
I don't think out of bounds should be an issue. The out of bounds areas, especially on that A map, are largely down the mountainside. So once they're up, which checkpoints 1 and 2 are designed to get them up and out, there's really no need for them to be dropping down. If they're dropping down, they're doing something wrong, or something is wrong and they are purposely leaving the plateau to get out of there. Yeah, the trails are a great question. I think mapping software has just gotten a lot more reliable. So, it used to be 10 years ago, we would have thrown a map at them and it would have been a bit of a wild card as to what the trails look like. Now, for the most part, what they see is what they're going to get. I think there's a couple of exceptions. There always are. The Pennsylvania woods are, they are littered with thousands of miles of old trail beds from our mining and lumber days. And so, I think the things they see on the map will largely be reliable. But the interesting question about, off trail here is you start running into these old unmapped routes. And then, what's your experience? What's your intuition tell you? That said, there definitely are some, I think, challenging off-trail sections. So I think that there's opportunity for micro issues when teams are trying to find checkpoints.
Great. Abby, I'm going to come to you in a second, but I want to make another comment for the people who are at home and who are watching and following to drive home the point that Brent touched upon, that in terms of understanding this course, there's a tremendous amount of places during, I'm assuming the entire course, where there's a lot of human nature interaction. And so you might see buildings and roads and trails that are cut that might not be out there, which adds a level of complexity to the map. And also is more complex. This is a North American championship. As a result, teams are coming into the area that have not raced in this area before. And that's going to be something to watch. And so for those who are at home following the dots, keep an eye out for that. People may be pulled off course. They think they're on the right road. Maybe it's a parallel error, who knows, but they get pulled in that direction. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind when you're home and you're yelling at the computer because your team is off course. It might be because they're there.
Yeah.
So,
One more thing I'll just throw out there. I don't think it'll be much of an issue, but there are a number of deer fence areas on stage A. And for those that don't know about deer fences, there are sections of woods. They're usually like areas that have been logged. And what the forest does is they build a high fence around it. Basically like a really, I mean, they're big, wide open kind of mesh squares. A squirrel could get through them, but a deer can't. And so they build these fences and they don't really appear on maps. Sometimes they pop up well on satellite, sometimes they don't. You can get through some of them. There are gates in them here and there. I have been in races where I've seen people and have been part of it where you make a decision to actually climb over the fence and try to cut through. And it tends to be very thick. But sometimes there are like old logging routes and you can get through it. There are several of these, and for various reasons, they didn't map well. So we're giving teams kind of cautions about them, and the way we laid out the checkpoints, they shouldn't be much of a temptation, but they might be. They might get in the way of some of the route choice, and it'll be interesting to see if anyone, tries to go through them or they take the long way around, which is probably the right move.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak to two different things you just mentioned. One is the human-natural interaction. This course goes through very little in the way of infrastructure, but one place where, and I want to flag this for racers, but also for anyone who is listening to this, who may be out in the area following the course, cheering for a team, the TA1 is at the Forksville Fairgrounds, and right across the street is Big Mike's. And Big Mike's is a hoagie shop, is a cheesesteak shop. They'll do breakfast sandwiches. But Mike, who is the owner and is just like a lovely, lovely human being, he's from Philly, and his shop has been voted as having some of the best cheesesteaks in the state. So for anyone who's looking for a really good sandwich, like it's authentic Philly cheesesteaks.
On the ground advice. Go ahead. Next.
On the ground. And I promise, like, we will show up at Big Mike's. Our volunteers will show up at Big Mike's. I suspect some of the racers will stop in at Big Mike's too. The other thing I wanted to mention, you brought up tracking and folks at home watching the dots. This is a very remote course. We've talked to Mark Harris, who runs Enabled Tracking. The North Central and Western Pennsylvania is among the least cell-covered area in the country. It's pretty wild for, Pennsylvania being on the East Coast. The cell coverage is really inconsistent. So there will be sections on the course where racers or dot watchers will have a little bit of trouble following along. We're working really hard with Mark to mitigate those issues as much as we can. We will have some Starlinks set up. And I know you said you want to talk about media in the end, so I'll hold off on that. But we're going to do our best to keep folks up to date on what's going on, both through the dots and through our social media channels and our live updates. So if you see a dot that is just kind of stuck for longer than you think it should be, the races are probably fine. They're just in a dead zone.
Right. And we also say, too, all of the Mark Harris does a great job. Hard work, technology is difficult sometimes. That all of the results as they're shown on the tracking page are conditional, predicated upon final certification by the race organizers. So it's everyone at home. And I think for the most part, folks are beginning to recognize that as part of the culture of racing. That's what we have to expect here. Okay, if we're not careful, we'll be on stage one as long as the racers are. So let's go over to TA1, the fairgrounds. I know we're talking paddle. I know we're not talking no paddle. For the sake of the conversation, begin with the no paddle option, how that's going to affect the course. And if you want to touch on the paddle in case we get big rain this week, we don't want to leave people hanging. So TA1, they finish the trek. They're on the bike. What comes next?
Yeah. So as I said at the beginning, what was already a big bike is going to get bigger. So from start to finish, from TA1 up until TA5, they are going to cover approximately 70 miles. And again, there's a short 5-6 mile trek that will give them a little bit of a break. But, we're tacking on probably 18 to 20 miles of biking now at the front of what was already a relatively long stage for a one-day race. It'll be a relatively fast stage. Honestly, just the nature of what we're tying together here for the trekking means that the biking is relatively straightforward this year. So, all but about 7 or 8 miles of it are effectively roads. There are some stretches where, there's one stretch where there's a section of trail, which could be pretty challenging. We can talk about that. But other than that one relatively short stretch, that's around checkpoint E1, the rest of it really it's all road. It's a mix of pavement, dirt road, gravel road, some, like ATV access trail type road. But for the most part, it will be pretty quick. In the middle of that, or not really in the middle, but a third of the way into it, they will encounter the mountain bike orienteering section, which should be relatively fun and quick. Again, 7 to 8 miles on this. I think there are about 10 checkpoints, maybe 11 or 12. Most of those checkpoints are visible on the side of the trail. There's one or two that are tucked away a little bit more. If you're dialed in, shouldn't be much of a problem. If you're not dialed in, it can be pretty easy to blow a turn in this trail network, especially for those teams that are in there in the dark. This was designed to have all the teams mountain biking in the dark, which I think would have been more interesting for the lead teams to really have to contend with that. Now I have a feeling that, some of the top teams, maybe some short course teams that really try to move ahead fast, get in there in the daylight, which could be a major advantage if people can pull that off, which I think they probably can.
So let me just review that again real quickly here. So they get the TA1, they're on the bike. They have a 70-mile bike in front of them. Along the way, there's going to be put the bike down, trekking section, back on the bike, and keep going.
Yeah. So what they're actually going to technically do, right, is when they leave TA1, assuming we're canceling the paddle, is they're going to ride to TA3. They're going to skip TA2. They're going to ride to TA3. We're going to make a couple of checkpoint modifications to route them there. And then when they get to TA3, they will get their map for the mountain bike orienteering loop. They will do the mountain bike orienteering loop, check back in at TA3, which is now technically TA4. And then they will leave for another 40 miles or so of road riding. And at roughly halfway to 2/3 of the way through that 40-mile stretch, they have the opportunity to go out on this small trek, which is entirely optional. I think more teams will get to do it now. And it is a bit of a deceiving little trek, to be honest. So I think it could be fun that more people are doing this little trek. But before, I expected that a fair number of teams might actually just skip it altogether to get to the final trek of the leg.
And if I'm wrong, walk me. Is that trek at Crystal Lake?
No. The mountain biking orienteering loop is at Crystal Lake, and then the embedded foot loop is out of checkpoint. I think it's number 16. Mm-hmm. And that's at the Jacoby Falls trailhead. So there's a big parking lot there, and they'll check in with some race staff. They'll drop their bikes, and they do what looks like a very straightforward 5 to 6 mile trek. And I have a feeling there's going to be some stunned faces coming off that little trek. Because
they're going to see the length on the map versus compared to the complexity of the trek, and it's going to fall apart a little bit for them.
Yeah, and so what happens is when you look at the map, there's a trail that basically takes you up through the logical flow, I think, is you take the trail up through the first two checkpoints, which I don't have the map in front of me. I can probably open it here in 1 second if I hem and haw long enough. They would look at the map and think to themselves, well, let's trek up to E4, which is at the waterfall, which is going to be bone dry. And then up to E3, which is at a saddle above the waterfall, about 2/3 of a kilometer further on. And then you bushwhack up and over a mountain back toward the TA, and there's a checkpoint up high. And you'd come down the reentrant from the checkpoint and then go back to the TA. And it looks like this relatively tight little loop. The problem is when you try to go over the top of that mountain, you're going to get some thick vegetation, and you're going to be doing it in the dark, and it's going to be challenging. So we don't seek to put necessarily that kind of Pennsylvania character building experience, as Joel calls it. Our teammate Joel, who set that section, came off it and said, "Well, that's a character builder," and I said, "It is," and that's not ever necessarily our goal, but sometimes it organically works itself into the course. And as long as it's not, 10 miles of that, sometimes it's suitable. So it's going to be challenging. The descent down the mountain as well, it's incredibly technical, kind of coming down this reentrant, and steep. So it's a slow descent. And I think people are going to come out feeling like, wow, like that looks short and easy, and that was anything but. So
Abby, we're talking October in Pennsylvania. They had a wet summer, unfortunately, not a wet fall. What are we looking at here in terms of like how thick will the vegetation be? How hard will it be to move through all of that? Like, will we have overgrown trees, leaves, forests? Because it's still fall out there, right? So it's not winter where everything is down off the trees.
Yeah, no, it won't be quite as thick as the height of summer, but they're still going to look at relatively, dense woods. Characteristically, there'll probably be some stretches with some feeling like you're like in the deep forest, right? Some sections will be more open, but Pennsylvania has its characteristic rhododendron fields and stuff you kind of have to pick your way through slowly. It will also be absolutely stunning, right? Like we are entering the peak of fall foliage. The end of October in Pennsylvania is just awash in red and orange. And because we haven't had big storms blowing in, like the integrity of the leaves are, they're still on the trees. So they will be under canopy. And especially during the day. And if it gets really cold overnight, they may even see some additional color popping for the second trek the next morning. So I think everybody is in for a treat in terms of landscape.
What's nice is with all those beautiful orange leaves is that the checkpoint flags are also orange, right? So they have the added bonus of more character building.
More character building.
Right.
The other thing that's interesting, I think, based on what Brent was just saying, typically we do have a relatively big overnight trek in our 24-hour to 30-hour adventure races. That's something that the land allows for and we enjoy putting in. And this course as designed, we expected the top teams to finish in 28 to 29 hours. So they would be out for much of the full course. The first trek will be entirely during the day, and much of the last section as designed would have been entirely during the day. So this overnight's embedded foot loop would have been largely the only overnight trekking they would have gotten. Now, with the paddle likely being canceled, we're probably looking at 23 to 25 hour winning time, barring adverse conditions, essentially. But the top racers racing in peak form, I think 23 to 25 hours. So they may act at a substantial section. That second large trek overnight, more in keeping with a typical rootstock race, ironically.
You mentioned adverse conditions there, and we're recording this a week out, right? So a week out is speculative at best. What will the racers be experiencing, do you think, weather-wise? Cold, dry, wet, windy? Once again, we're kind of guessing a little bit, and the folks at home should check also, but what are you preparing the racers for as you message them now about the race?
Right now, there's about I think it's like a 30-degree swing between the high and the low. So overnight, they could see high 30s, potentially even colder in some of the higher altitudes, and mid to high 60s during the day. So I think they're going to experience a little bit of everything. Right this second, it looks quite dry. Across the state right now, we're experiencing. I'm not worried about fires at all.
Right.
We are not a state that is prone to fires, but we live in Philadelphia, and there was a fire warning in Philly because of this drought. So there are creeks all over the course, right? There's a lot of groundwater, but I think by and large, this will be a much drier race than folks are accustomed to in typical, Pennsylvania fall conditions.
Yeah. For anybody who follows weather patterns in the national championships, we got our average rainfall done during nationals. All the water got out of the way because it rained and rained and rained, and karma is, I think, averages out over time. Brent, keep walking us through the course. What's next?
Yeah, so you know what? I'll just take you back for 1 minute. I'd alluded to this, and I think the listeners might be curious to know why people slow down around checkpoint E1, which is an optional checkpoint on the bike route. And, just again, as I noted, the nature of this route, there's not a lot of opportunity to get them, off trail for any kind of interesting navigation or, trail riding other than Crystal Lake. But when they ride into E1, E1 is at a trail junction with the Loyalsock Trail, which is a no bikes allowed trail. So for teams that decide to detour off the direct, relatively fast downhill road that they'd be on, they're going to have a pretty long Jeep track ride to get to E1, and then they have to hike a bike for a few hundred meters just to get off the Loyalsock Trail. They can't ride on the Loyalsock Trail. From there, they descend the Painter Run Trail, and that Painter Run Trail is a really proper technical wilderness-based trail. It's a couple kilometers of riding, maybe as much as 3, I don't know offhand, 2 to 3 kilometers. And the first few hundred meters of that, frankly, like I would be surprised if anyone can ride it. And they'll probably be wondering what have we gotten themselves into. Once they get through that, it is rideable, but it'll be dark. And even in the daylight, like it's still a pretty technical trail. So I'm thinking that teams that go in there, and we're going to hint at this to be honest, because we don't want some of our beginner teams deciding to go for that one and then, come out hours later. But for some teams, it could end up being like a walk the whole way if they're not prepared for what they're getting into. So that's one to watch. I think that could really, shake up a couple teams along the way. When they finish the bike, they'll check in at TA5, which is where we are loading everyone on buses on Saturday morning before the race. And they'll TA there. They're going to be able to TA out of their car. They don't know that. We've kind of kept that bit secret, just for the sake of the race. But when they arrive on Saturday morning, they'll set up a TA at their car. They'll have their bins there. So they'll get in, they'll check in, and they'll head out on what I think is measured at a 16 to 18 mile trek. And 16 to 18 miles doesn't seem that long. This is a rugged but spectacular trek. Joel, our teammate Joel, set it for us last weekend. And he came off and said, that's, the most beautiful day I've had in the woods in years. And that's even without the water. There's spectacular double kind of double reentrant waterfalls. There are some water courses that are just waterfall after waterfall after waterfall. It is extremely remote. So when you're up there, it looks like you're never that far from a road, but you are hours and hours away from being able to get out if you need to get out, if you need to bail out, or if we unfortunately need to get up there to help someone. They really have to be self-sufficient up there. The other thing that's really cool about this trek is there's an old mining town. This is called the McIntyre Wilderness Area, and McIntyre was an old coal mining town years and years and years ago, decades ago. And I don't know the number offhand, but as I recall, we were talking about thousands of people living up there. I think like 2, 3, 4,000 people used to live up in this mining town. And, there's not much left of that, to be honest, but there are remnants and they're really unique and they're really interesting to explore. There's some old mine entrances. There's an old cemetery. There's a bunch of old foundations. There's giant mounds of coal. And for about the first half of the trek, for short course teams, probably the whole trek, they will also be passing through all the old mining kind of ditches and troughs and ridges and mounds that were left behind by all that mining activity. And some of the checkpoints are, placed within those. So they're going to have to kind of climb around and wander through some of those old mining areas. It's got it all. It's got a beautiful vista. It has, some big remote kind of old marshes, which will be a lot easier to contend with because of how dry it is. Good chance for wildlife sighting. I think it'll probably be too cool for them, but I ran into a whole bunch of rattlesnakes when I was out there. I've seen bears up in that area before. So I think it's going to be a really stunning stage for folks, no matter how much of it they take on.
I'm pretty certain I've been up there in previous rootstock events. I've been up in this area, correct?
Yeah, we did a Stockville there, 2018, I believe. Mm-hmm. And we went back, as Brent said, and looked at our roster from that race. And you were among the only people who have anything to do with this race and you're not racing, who went up into that area. One of the things that I find most interesting about that space is the cemetery. Brent and I were up there scouting that Stockville and discovered that there were dozens of people, many of them kids, who all died within the same year, maybe within the same few months. And at the time, I remember thinking about reaching out to the Historical Society to see if there was some epidemic that went through, or yes, it seemed disease related, but we didn't have any insight into that specifically, and I lost track of it. So maybe this race will kind of give me the nudge to go back and call them. But it's just a fascinating area. Again, like our races tend to really dive into that intersection between the natural world and the industrial heritage of Pennsylvania, and this is kind of the epitome of that.
Yeah, it's right. As I look at this here, and so if I so this is a bit of my now being speculative in terms of the race for the people who are home. I remember this, for example, like F7, 23, F9, they're sitting on strip mines are shown there. And what's interesting about that was that there were these wildly unnatural piles of earth that had been dropped at you up and down, and they were like it were football fields worth of them, huge, massive part. And by the time you get there in the race, you're really at the back end. First of all, this is the final big, massive trek in a really rugged area. And I also want to be even more speculative, and I will own this if I am wrong. I think we will have very nice dot watching coverage up there because that's pretty high. If I'm guessing, if I'm wrong, come get me. Don't go after Brent Navy. But I think we'll be pleased by that point of the race in terms of what we're seeing here. But this is going to be for the folks that want to clear the course, this is going to be a pretty complex stage. And also, there's a lot of route choice on there, which the dot watchers will see.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I honestly can't remember what we put down on paper. I think maybe 7 hours was our fast estimate for this, which, again, for 16 miles for some of these elite teams that are going to be there, that seems off. And, there are a couple fast teams, and if they knocked an hour or so off our time, I wouldn't be surprised with those teams. They're just incredible. But I also think it's deceptive. Joel went out and set it. He didn't even actually set every point that's out there, but he set most of it. He didn't do the in and out of town. He kind of parked up in the area and set it. And I think it took him 9.5 hours, maybe 10. And he wasn't racing, right? But like you start kind of. He also had the benefit of having a GPS unit to double check where he was, right, to make sure that he was setting things properly. Right. So, a couple of nav mistakes and you've lost an hour or two, and all of a sudden things start, becoming much more challenging. So those top teams, they should have plenty of time. So I don't think it's going to be the difference of, clearing the course or not, or having to leave things as the original design would have probably forced them to consider. But it could really make for some very interesting dot watching. And I hope you're right. I think you might be right. I think the tough thing is the beginning of the stage and the end of the stage when they're down along Rock Run, there won't be anything in there. So we won't really, it'll probably be, having to wait for a good hour or so before teams pop up once they get up there. And at a certain point, they're going to disappear and we're not going to know where they are until they get to the finish line in town.
And I believe we will be manually entering the finish times and finish scores. I think Mark said that we'll have to do that in order to have the system update.
Yeah, I think also for the folks who are going to be following this at home, I look at the map and they'll see this. Folks at home, you've listened to this and now you're looking at the dot watch, looking at the tracking here. Clearly, teams they're going to go up 18, right? That's where they're going to go. I know that they'll work up there, mandatory coming down that 24, 25. That's a very, very steep, gnarly. It will be dry-ish because of the rain, but that descent down. I remember doing that descent, and that's quite the descent. And back on the road, and they have Rock Run, and they have to take care of all of that. But I do agree. I think that one of the great parts about this race is I look at that you're finishing on such an ambitious and such a strong expected trek to wrap the race up. Clearly, we have teams, heavy hitters coming in. They'll be looking to clear the course. They'll be looking to take care of it. So some teams will be going pretty far to the north, F6, F5, F4. And I will caution people at home, you look at the map, you'll be like, well, those checkpoints are right near each other. How hard could it be? Right.
They're hard.
They're hard.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's one of those, it looks straightforward and it looks easy. And, just like having been up there by myself a lot, it's like, you get up there and you start realizing, wow, like it's taken me a lot longer to get up here than I thought it would. And I've got a long way to go before I get out of here. Just to, give a little more perspective, if folks are following along while we're talking here, when you look at our map, there's a road that kind of gets you up into the southern half of this trek, which is what we're kind of saying is like, that's the mandatory trek, right? And so that road passes just below checkpoint 18. And you look at that road, and it's like 4 to 5 kilometers up that road to basically get into the heart of the checkpoints, minus those outliers to the north. I drove that when I was designing it so that I could park my car up top and do some work from my car. And it took me 45 minutes to drive that road, like 4 to 5K. It's just like, it is really tough terrain up there. What you see on there, like the roads and such, they are rutted out. They're full of permanent, water courses and puddles and, like deep ditches. And that kind of characterizes the landscape in general up there, not just on the road. So it's not fast. It's not easy. Everything is going to be challenging. And when you're getting in that mining area, like it's all slow and it's really easy to lose a lot of time up there.
Media team. Abby, talk to us who you have there covered and what can the people at home expect?
Yeah, we're super excited. We have a really diverse group of folks coming out to cover the race, or diverse roles to cover the race. So we have Nick Winia, who is this incredible black and white documentary photographer. Nick will be out shooting in black and white. Randy Erickson is very generously making the trip from South Dakota to shoot in color. We have Adrian McCurrett, who is a racer based out of Ontario, who didn't have a team to come down with, and he's decided to come down and do embedded media, embedded video. So he's going to be hanging out with folks at some of the most remote points of the course, making sure not to guide anyone to checkpoints or interfere with anyone's races. And then he's going to be coming out of the woods as those stages clear and sending off his media to Jeff O'Connor, who is kind of running our digital storytelling. I think Jeff will be in the woods some, but he will also be at a house that we have on course. Actually, 2 of our volunteers have an Airbnb on the course, and they very generously offered it to us for the weekend. So Jeff will be there doing kind of working his magic from the tech side and the storytelling side. Like Jeff has really made his name in telling the story of adventure racing. He may also have some folks out with him to do a long-ish form documentary after the race. Brian, you are doing this podcast, and then you're going to do a flash podcast the evening of the race. So Saturday evening, you'll have Alyssa Godesky as one of your guests doing dot watching analysis. You'll have Wayne Leake, who's actually on site as the ARWS referee, but he's going to step off course for an hour and be one of the voices offering commentary. We have an independent filmmaker coming out she's working on a documentary about kind of the healing power of movement, but she will be capturing video on the course. And then there's a chance we're going to have a couple of college students out helping Jeff as well. So we have this really robust team whose sole job is to tell the story of the race and the experience that the racers are having.
So if I just listened to this podcast for the first time, and if I just learned about this the first time, where should I go on the internet? Where should I go in social media to follow that story?
Yeah, so most of the coverage will be channeled through our Rootstock Racing social media channels. So Rootstock Racing on Facebook, Rootstock Racing on Instagram. Jeff, I suspect, will also be posting on his Adventure Racing Insider page. And then after the race, he's going to put together a standalone site for all of the coverage, kind of a repository for all of the coverage, which we will link to on the Rootstock page. And of course, everyone should go to the Dark Zone feed on Apple Podcasts or wherever they listen to their podcasts to get your coverage, Brian.
And on that programming note, you mentioned that this is dropping the morning of the race. So this is for the people, this is coming out after the racers get on the buses. We'll be recording a flash podcast at 9:00 that evening. You mentioned Alyssa, you mentioned Wayne. Hopefully get one of you two on there if possible. We'll see who we can get on there. We'll do some live analysis. Then we will drop that immediately afterwards. So that's like 10:00 Saturday night that will come out. I always like to mention that that's a relatively raw podcast. We record it and we go live pretty quickly with it. And so therefore it's not as tailored as our usual editions because we want to get it out in terms of speed.
The other place, of course, racers should direct their attention is the ARWS feeds. This race will be kind of cross-listed on the Rootstock page and ARWS. ARWS may offer some of their own dot watching analysis, both on the main page and also on the ARWS North America page. I know folks at ARWS are very excited to have a North America regional series for the first time. This is the second year of the series, but the first year of the championship. So I think there's a lot of good energy at it. And we will also be announcing at the end of the race the host organization for the 2025 regional championship. So lots of good energy, lots of good information coming out.
Wonderful. I want to do closing thoughts on the course. Brent, I'm going to kick it to you, and then Abby, I'm going to kick it to you for the final word. So Brent, course itself, thinking about the adjustments, the paddle or lack thereof, what could the person at home watching expect to see when they watch and they log in and they follow the dots and they follow all the commentary?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're watching this course, pay attention to the trekking. You know, we really believe philosophically in working with what you've got. And so this year, biking is not necessarily a highlight of the course, even though it's going to be, I think some teams are going to spend a fair bit of time in that saddle. Probably, you'll see some teams probably essentially on their bikes for 10 or so hours, maybe even longer. 70 miles isn't like extremely long, but in an adventure race with everything else, like that could take a while. But the trekking is really where things are going to get interesting. So, to me, the biking is almost an interlude, right? The navigation's pretty straightforward. So as long as teams are paying attention, with the exception of the mountain bike orienteering loop, which could be a fun little watch. I think that's a time for everyone to relax. Dot watchers can go do something else and just get geared up for those treks. And we're just going to cross our fingers that the coverage is great for those, because you're right, they'll be up high. So there's a decent chance that a fair bit of the trekking will be viewable. But I think that will be the make or break section for everybody. And I want to stress, it's not just about those top teams, right? Like, yeah, it'll be fun watching the top. And I think on paper, we've got 8 or 9 teams that we think are all capable of winning this race, which is incredible. So we're really excited to watch that. But, especially with the shortened course, it's going to be fun watching, the next 20 or 30 teams who probably normally don't think too much about clearing a course, but are good teams that do a lot of the course. They're going to have a shot. So it'll be fun to cheer those teams on. And for the teams that are behind them, who are, less experienced, maybe not as strong with the maps, that don't have the same training base, they're new to the sport. It's going to be fun just watching them work through the course. And it is an accessible course, but it'll be fun to see what kind of micro adventures they all have, because I think they're going to have some good ones.
From my perspective, I look forward to having raced in this area and having done rootstock events there in the past. I'm really excited for the interaction of the many teams that are coming in for the championship's sake, who are going to collide, and I'm using that term on purpose, they're going to collide with the terrain and the challenge and the navigation. And I'm really curious, because in my take on it is that they're going to hear about the shortened paddle, right? The lack of paddle is the shortened course, and they're going to want to go faster. Speed now becomes of the essence, and as a result, a lot of these teams are going to want to go on the course. And we all know that the faster you try to go, the gap gets wider when it comes to navigation. And as a result, I'm really curious to see how the terrain meeting the navigation meeting the relatively, I'm going to use the word complex, not the right word to use, but there's a lot to navigate out there, no pun intended, when it comes to human stuff, things like that. So I think it's a really good mix where it's all going to drop together, and we'll see how it shakes out. But to your point, let's not lose sight of those teams that are going to come out here and they're going to have a chance to really shine, because the course as it's presented gives them a chance to get to more of it. So I really like that part of it. Abby.
Yeah, I mean, can I just have one final thought?
Sure.
Just I think we've hit on this, but a slightly different way. You can't move fast in a lot of this land, and I think a lot of people, especially that haven't raced here, they don't fully appreciate it until they've experienced it. And we have a number of really good teams coming who have not seen this before, at least not here. And I mean, they're great teams. They've seen it elsewhere, but it's probably not what they're expecting. I think Pennsylvania is this really underappreciated wilderness area. And the simple reality is, like, you can't move fast in our land when you're on foot. You just can't. And I think that's going to play a big role in this race. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great thing for the listeners at home to know watching the race, that's going to be a limitation. Abby, close us out.
I think as we've been trying to offer, like we've worked really hard to to create what I hope is a championship caliber course. And I'm looking at the team list now, and we have a championship level field showing up. Like the caliber of this field, I don't know that we've ever seen at a rootstock race. And I can't remember a race in North America that we've seen the depth of this field before. We have top racers from Canada, top racers from the United States. What I am really struck by is the number of race directors that are coming. And I think, as Brent is alluding to, this is a thinking person's race in some ways. This is a thinking person's course. And I will be really curious to see how race directors use their course design brain to navigate their way through this journey, and to talk to them afterward to get a sense of how much they kind of tapped into that to try to puzzle out the course. So I'm so excited to be on the dot watching end of this one. I can't wait to see the battles that play out across the divisions.
Well, there you have it, folks. Another episode of the Dark Zone Adventure Racing Podcast. Stop listening to me. Get online. Go check out that race. Follow Two Rivers. Enjoy. Good luck to everybody. I hope everyone does great during the race. It's our honor to bring this course reveal podcast to you. And like I always say, if you like what you're hearing, please head over to your platform of choice and like and click and subscribe. Thank you for being here. Thanks for being a listener. And I'll say it again. If you keep racing, we'll keep talking.